So the next speaker I'd like to introduce is Francesca Albanese from Crisis, the homelessness charity. And Francesca is the head of research and evaluation at Crisis. Now, I'm also very pleased to just note that Crisis actually, as part of their Crisis Venture Studio program, is actually one of Agile's investors. So we have a good relationship with Crisis, and in fact Crisis was instrumental in helping us with the wording of our mission lock in our memorandum and articles of association as a values-led organisation, trying to make sure we can both role model how to make a commercial entity really vibrant, but at the same time keeping our mission right in focus. So Francesca, if you'd like to come up to the podium, that would be great. In addition to her work at Crisis since 2016, Francesca coordinates the Housing First Europe Research Cluster, and prior to being at Crisis, Francesca built up a lot of experience at Homeless Link and Shelter, and the initial foundation was a PhD in housing policy, I gather. So Francesca, thank you very much for speaking today, and over to you.
Thank you. And it's been really nice to be invited to this as well. And I think it's the first in-person conference I've been to in quite a long time to speak. So it's nice to actually see people's faces rather than looking at a Zoom screen and wondering how people are responding to what you're saying. As described, Crisis, we are the national homelessness charity. So we work in 12 locations across GB. We provide services to people at risk of and experiencing homelessness, which looks at access to housing. It also looks at providing people with support in terms of them being able to stay in those homes and not experience homelessness again. But a big part of our work is campaigning for change. And so I hope with this presentation, it's kind of putting a bit more onto the why we all need to act, and kind of what the current state is in terms of housing need. And that's kind of what I'm going to cover off in my presentation. I'm also aware I'm the last slot before caffeine. So don't worry, I'm keeping my eye on that clock to make sure that everyone keeps energized for the day. I also loved the Sistine Chapel picture in your presentation earlier. I'm afraid I don't have anything as grand as that, but hopefully some kind of exploration of what the problem is at the moment. So I'm just going to quickly start with some of the trends and drivers of homelessness. I'm aware there'll be people in the room who are very knowledgeable on this, but I just wanted to make sure that we're all on the kind of same starting point, and for us why we exist as a charity and why we think more needs to be done. So when we think about homelessness and kind of what drives it, in the UK, poverty is the most important driver of homelessness. It's what pushes most people into homelessness. Linked to that, and why we're all here, is the availability and affordability of housing and homes on all levels and all types. And this is at the moment very influenced also by welfare policy, and I'll come on to talk about that a bit more. There was we talked about it before, but we're seeing increasing numbers of people approaching their local authority who are in work, either part-time or full-time, and that has gone up over the past few years. Also, discrimination is a driver of homelessness. So whether that's racism, and it's something we're doing some work on at the moment, or more widely the hostile environment and policies that design in homelessness rather than solve it. We also know that there are trigger factors, so things like relationship breakdown, losing a job, experiencing mental or physical health issues, or a bereavement kind of can be that trigger point where people end up homeless or kind of are pushed into homelessness. And for a small minority, we know that there is support needs such as trauma and substance misuse and offending. So we know that homelessness is going up, and I use this graph because it also points to when homelessness went down recently, because policies changed. So we have seen an upward increase in homelessness. We do a piece of research with Heriot-Watt University called the Homelessness Monitor Series, and what we've also looked at is triangulating different data sets. So it's not, we look at local authority statistics of the number of people who have approached as homeless, but we also look at sofa surfing, squatting, people living in non-residential buildings, because we also know that often people don't approach their local authority for assistance or are not recorded. So the graph up there is the data set we kind of look at ourselves. And what you note there is 2020 is the last date. We're in the midst of updating it in terms of kind of what's going on at the moment. But what you saw there is a pandemic response. So we actually saw policy interventions happen over the pandemic. So that was things like the furlough scheme, which was we see that as a homeless prevention intervention because it kept income stable. There was an eviction moratorium. We also saw huge efforts made by local authorities up and down the country to work with people rough sleeping, at risk of rough sleeping, and putting them into hotels and other forms of temporary accommodation. And we actually saw rough sleeping numbers in London go down for the first time in a long time. Now, all that has gone, and we're starting to see numbers go up again across the board. And particularly the number of Section 21 notices has rapidly increased, and also the number of people coming forward whose landlords either are selling their property or have sold their property. And so I think that's kind of a reminder of the kind of wider context that we're working in and the kind of drivers of homelessness. It was mentioned earlier, but temporary accommodation placements have gone up. And it's gone up over the last 10, 12 years. Bed and breakfast in particular is a huge issue in England. It's tripled, more than tripled in the last 10 years, and it's continuing to go up. And we spend a lot of money every year managing homelessness, not ending it. So we spend over £1 billion on temporary accommodation, and that money could definitely be better spent giving people homes and access to housing. So there are housing market challenges, and I know this is something that's been picked up in both previous presentations, so I'll just quickly run through the ones that I think are the most pertinent to why homelessness still exists and is something that's solvable. So rents are rising, and they have been outpacing wages. And again, I think it's quite interesting just to note that we did see a dip in private rents during the pandemic, but that has started to go up again, and it's continuing to go up. And again, this graph only goes up to June. It's gone up since then, both London and outside of London. Actually, what we've seen is kind of rents outside of London rapidly going up. Need exceeds supply. So we can get into a numbers game on housing, and I don't want to do that, but I suppose I just want to make the broad point that when you start looking at housing needs, so are people currently living in the type of accommodation that is most suited to them? The answer is overwhelmingly no. So the National Housing Federation did some research last year which showed that 8.5 million people were not in the right type of accommodation to meet their needs. And overwhelmingly, half of them would be more suited in the current market we have to social housing. And large numbers of those households have children. So we have done some modelling around with the National Housing Federation on what we think is needed in terms of supply. I'll go on to talk a bit more about what we mean by that, because I agree with Paul's point earlier that it isn't about just throwing houses up, it's about the right sorts of houses in the right areas of the right quality. But we kind of have looked at the kind of current need, and this is what we think, so 90,000 social rented homes per year for the next 15 years is currently based on the need that we have in England. There's also issues with access to current social housing stock. So this graph here is about new lettings by housing associations. And currently in England, around 24% of new lets go to people experiencing homelessness. In Scotland, it's 50%. So there are differences, and that does differ by area and housing association, but broadly it is quite low for people who are experiencing homelessness. And it's something actually we're doing some more work on at the moment around social housing allocations, because I'm also aware that if there isn't enough stock, that means difficult decisions are made around kind of how property is allocated. We are a homelessness charity. We work with members every day, and these are just some of the things we see at the moment, and it makes it very, very difficult for us to find suitable and affordable and accessible accommodation for people that we work with. So we have housing procurement teams, and their jobs are to source properties for people who we are working with who are either at risk of losing their current home or are already homeless, and they're finding it harder than ever before to find suitable properties. We particularly note a lack of supply of one-bedroom properties in the areas that we're working in, and there's an increasingly competitive rental market for those properties. We often find that there are exclusionary practices, so we have a lot where people can't access properties if they're on housing benefit, or we also work with people coming out of prison who may not be able to kind of rent properties. In England and Wales, we still have something called priority need, whereby if you're not found deemed to be in priority need, you aren't owed a housing duty. We work with many people who aren't in priority need, and therefore it's, again, very, very difficult to get over that barrier and to find people affordable and accessible housing. Whilst in Scotland, they haven't had priority need for 10 years, what we're still finding at the moment is there's still a reliance on temporary accommodation, and that is switching, and I will say a little bit more about that. My radical point is we can't end homelessness without homes. And the reason why I'm saying that is because quite often that's a point that's missed, and there's a lot of talk about support needed and temporary accommodation and hostels. I'm not saying support isn't required, but we also need the homes in the first place. And it is far more beneficial for somebody who's just lost their home to be put into a home immediately with the support around them, rather than to be waiting years on a waiting list, or to be living in unsuitable accommodation, or going from different temporary accommodation to different temporary accommodation, or even worse, spending months and years sleeping on the streets. So we know there's a cost of living crisis, and you can't go anywhere at the moment without kind of being aware of that. But I think it's really important to put kind of the current challenges that I mentioned into context. So I mentioned before that housing affordability is also very linked to kind of welfare, the welfare system and welfare policy. What we found is that housing benefit was frozen in 2019, and so the current benefit rates that people get for housing is still at 2019 levels. That is not high enough, particularly as we're seeing rents going up, and affordability as a consequence is getting worse. So we did some research with Zoopla a few months ago, where we looked at 12 months worth of properties. That graph there kind of indicates in the purple percentage of new listings that were affordable at the housing benefit rate in the area, and the red is the number of households that are on housing benefit in that area. And whilst we know that rents change, we also know that new people come into kind of needing to access the properties all the time. And we found that at the time, for the 12-month period we looked at, only around 12% of properties would be affordable to people on housing benefit. We're about to do that analysis again, because we think it's got worse, and I know other people have looked at this issue more recently and found that it has got worse. We also have done some modelling around kind of what's going on in terms of energy payments and food bills. So I think what this graph shows is essentially its income broken down by income decile. So it breaks households across the UK into 10 brackets. And what you can see there is monthly rent for somebody on the lowest 10% of incomes. This is on average, by the way. It's quite a significant chunk of your kind of your budget, your monthly budget. When you layer on food costs and also what we anticipate average energy costs will be in January, those households will be spending on average 16% above what they're actually earning. And so that is a problem. And it will push many people to the brink. And we know we're going to probably see a significant sort of increases across the board in terms of people struggling, getting into rent arrears, and kind of thinking about the kind of knock-on impacts of homelessness. I don't want to finish on doom and gloom, because there are solutions, and I think one of the reasons I was really excited to come to this conference actually was to hear from people who every day are trying to do things to kind of bring properties onto the market to improve affordability and accessibility of accommodation, and we've heard plenty of examples already this morning, and I know we're going to hear lots more this afternoon, so I'm going to just kind of run through a few of the ones that we're aware of, and also hopefully give you a bit of inspiration to go away and look at those. I think the other thing is we're quite interested in this area ourselves as an organisation. It's actually something we're looking at ourselves, whether or not we actually intervene in the housing market more directly, because of all the issues I've talked about. So it's also an open offer, ask to come and talk to me about things that you're doing that you know kind of are working, or ideas you might have. We're in a scoping phase at the moment and have been talking to a lot of people in the areas that we work with about whether or not there is potential, to kind of increase more supply and access for people who are on very, very low incomes and are either at risk of or experiencing homelessness. So I think centrally, it's also about making sure we're still building homes people want to live in. And I think that was really kind of well stated by Richard in his presentation earlier. It's about choice, about making sure that actually the homes that are built are the foundation for people to thrive and provide comfort and safety. And that can be in kind of whatever tenure, but there are 4 tests. So I've talked a lot about affordability. It is crucial. And I think, the premise of this conference as well is that, affordability has become an oxymoron. So, we do need to think more about how do we actually make properties affordable and genuinely affordable for everybody who needs them. It's also about accessibility. So that might be about, that's about kind of having the right homes in the right locations. I mentioned before, we often are dealing with quite a lot of barriers. There might be properties available at the rent that someone can afford, but they might not be able to access those, whether that's because of local policies or discriminatory practices. It's about being settled in a place as well. So the question at the end, which was about people want to own their own home, what about making renting better? And I think that's a kind of genuine question to open up as well, about whether or not can we make renting a more viable and attractive prospect through more settled housing. I previously worked at shelter and did a lot of research with families who had to move multiple times, and that was very, very disruptive for people, particularly in terms of school. I remember doing interviews with one family where they'd moved 6 times in 5 years and had to move their daughter to different schools in that time, and that was 10 years ago, and I know it's got worse. And I think the other kind of area is good quality homes, and I think definitely that's something that's come through very strongly already, and it's something that I think will be kind of a theme that's going to be discussed more throughout the day. The other side of it is for crisis, we also kind of believe that to tackle homelessness, it must mean being housing, and I put first in brackets, because housing first as an intervention is targeted very much at people with high support needs, and it is an incredibly well evidenced, and it works, solution where the housing is given to somebody first and then the support is around them. And what we're talking about is building system change so that everybody has a home first, and then their support needs are kind of built around that. So at one end of the scale, that might be somebody who has high and complex needs, that needs more kind of intense support. But the other end, that actually might mean somebody just needing a bit of help to put a deposit down on a rental property. And there's lots of things in between. But I think this dial is really shows kind of, essentially what we're talking about is homes first and making sure people get access to a home. And so some of the things, and this is just food for thought in terms of examples of solutions that work, the 50 out-of-the-box housing solutions is a publication that I know Agile Homes have been kind of part of the housing solution platform. It's a kind of European-wide initiative, and it's looking at different housing solutions, but particularly with an emphasis on homelessness and low-income households. I would recommend going and reading it because it's lots of inspiration in terms of people doing different things. It's really, really good. You know, we've talked about some of these already: modular housing, good quality modular housing, community land trusts, repurposing buildings for residential use. We had a really incredible talk by someone in Rochdale come and talk to us who's repurposed commercial property for residential purposes and is doing that at the moment for people who have been experiencing rough sleeping. I think retrofitting and renovation have already been mentioned, especially, you know, when we're talking about being sort of net zero and thinking about kind of climate change and kind of making sure that house building you know, is within that agenda. Housing associations with a purpose of ending homelessness. So both Finland and Spain have housing associations whose original purpose was to house people experiencing homelessness. They've since expanded, but the Y Foundation in Finland and Provienda in Spain are two models where that is their mission, and they have built on that, and they now kind of expanded their portfolio. And I think, you know, that's definitely something to think about in terms of kind of how you kind of develop a kind of a housing association model. And lastly, the kind of bringing empty homes into use, and kind of what that can do. I suppose my kind of last point is I really, this conference is all about new ideas, being innovative, making sure that we bring kind of new models to the market, kind of really emphasising that need for affordability, accessibility, and making it kind of for everybody, not just for the few. But we also need policy change too, and I'm going to just end on this. You know, we need more homes. So we do want people to kind of bring more homes onto market, but I think we also need investment if we're going to do it at the scale that's needed. Adopting a housing-led approach to address homelessness where it can't be prevented is a really good way of making sure we're not, just emphasising temporary accommodation all the time, making sure that we're kind of looking at how we can do that. In Scotland at the moment, they're in the transition phase where they're doing something called rapid rehousing transition models in local authorities, which is all about trying to move to this approach. We need housing benefit to cover the cost of rent. You know, it's frozen, it needs bringing in line with rents. We need a sustained support funding model to make sure that, the support is there and local authorities and housing associations can provide that. A better PRS offer. I think part of the reason why the private rented sector is not seen as suitable is because it isn't fit for purpose, but there's lots of things that can be done to make it fit for purpose. We currently have a campaign which is looking at regulating rogues in the exempt accommodation sector, and if anyone's interested more in that, please do kind of come and find me. And we also need to address barriers in terms of how housing is allocated at the moment. I'll stop there, and yeah, I think we've got about 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you very much, Francesca. And just while you think a little bit about what questions you want to ask, I just wanted to say, Francesca, I was very struck by your clear evidence there that policy does have an impact. The Everyone In Furlough and Evictions moratorium did reduce homelessness, so we can do it. The other thing that really struck me was your open invitation to people to connect with you, to gather ideas about crisis scoping of how they might play a different role in enabling and maybe even providing housing yourselves. Did I understand that correctly? Yes, brilliant. Okay, so please do liaise and share. And also the question about regulation, your regulatory activities. Anybody wants to connect with Francesca on that, please do. So questions for Francesca, please, before coffee.
Hi, thanks. Kerry Fielding. Funny enough, another CAT student. I've just done my master's as a Central Alternative Technology student here earlier. Francesca, great to hear you speaking. Thank you so much. At the age of 58 and facing a Section 21 eviction notice myself at the moment, I can very much relate to this. I've never been a homeowner. I would actually like to see housing models accommodate sustainable lifestyles in a way that takes us away from these funding models. Richard referred earlier to how housing white papers often seem to come and go like confetti. And the question I have to ask you is, of the 7,000 or so affordable homes that we're building a year at the moment, how many of those would you put down to roughly as the requirement of developers to build 30% of development as social housing? I understand, I think, is that still the case, that developers are still required to build 30% social housing? I raise that because I actually had a small part in bringing that piece of legislation about in about 1995 in Oxford. I lived on a canal boat there. Bellway Homes were building a new development, and we managed to get Oxford Brookes University involved in a big campaign against it. Didn't stop the development, of course, but it did provide the 30% social housing provision. At the time, to build those houses, they wanted all the narrow boats that we were living on as affordable homes to be removed, of course, because they spoilt the view. So I'm just really wondering, I can see the government's about to sweep away that 30% requirement to deliver 300,000 new homes a year. How many of the few homes we're building at the moment are because of that requirement?
So firstly, very sorry that you're facing a Section 21 eviction. If you're not getting support of that and want to have a side conversation, I can do afterwards. On your question, I'm going to say I don't know off the top of my head, so I'm really sorry. But you're right, and I think last year there was only around 7,000 homes built for social rent, which is very small compared to what's needed. And so I don't know exactly what proportion of that is because of the kind of Section 106 agreement, but I think the main point you're raising there is how do we get, what's the impetus for developers to use some of their kind of development for social rent? And I think at the moment not enough. And I think that's part of the problem. And I think the worry is if we're going to, it does look like that might be taken away, and also house building targets as well. And I think it's just making sure, doing that then needs to have something to replace it to ensure that actually the kind of suite of options that people have, the homes, are meeting need, rather than at the moment it's about making profit.
Hi there, my name's Cordelia. Thank you very much. Cordelia Hughes from Shared Assets, which is a social enterprise doing research and working on projects to do with access to land and creating a more just land system. My question is kind of about the research that you're doing, and I wanted to know more about how much work you're doing on kind of existing homes, because I went to an event a few weeks ago by Action on Empty Homes, and they said that, I know in Bristol alone there's more empty homes, including like Airbnbs and second homes, than there are homeless people or amounts of people that could fit in the homes. And I was wondering whether your work on kind of rogue operators has anything to do with that. Thanks.
So we aren't doing any research at the moment on empty homes, but it is something that we've kind of been looking at as, what at the moment are the barriers? Because yes, there are lots of empty homes, but there's also lots of reasons why those empty homes aren't brought onto the market and used. So there's some things around, like,
legislation, kind of policy, but there's also about where are those homes and making sure they're in places people want to live and in communities that people want to live. So I think that's definitely something, I'd be interested actually to hear a little bit more, maybe in the coffee break, just about kind of what you're doing, because I think it's that kind of, we do kind of have this quite a lot in terms of like, you know, number of homeless people now versus what could possibly solve that. I think the main issue, when I always make as well, is yes, on any given night now, there's around 237,000 households experiencing homelessness. We need a solution for them, but others are going, like other people are going to experience homelessness if there isn't things around that, so like preventing homelessness from happening in the first place. And actually, if you think about it in the kind of biggest, broadest sense, actually affordable housing and having lots of affordable housing is a really good model of prevention, because we know that lots of people are pushed into homelessness because of affordability issues in the UK. And that isn't the same actually elsewhere, and it's quite interesting when you start to look at, so yeah, we're not doing anything on empty homes, but I'd be interested to kind of find out more.
I think we're going to break for coffee now, if that's okay. Francesca, you're able to stay all day, aren't you? So I just invite people to grab hold of Francesca with any further questions that you have. So please can we thank all of our speakers from this morning.